Okay. Um, we're going to be looking at the PowerPoint I have for you on the scientific and social origin of eugenics. Now, I also left let me get in this circle better. I left a copy of this PowerPoint without the video, so you can look at it that way as well. So here we go. This particular PowerPoint looks at the scientific and social origins of eugenics. So first off, we start with what is eugenics. At its core, eugenics is a philosophy which hopes to improve the human race by promoting good breeding. What does that really mean? It means that it hopes that the human race will become richer, smarter, stronger by promoting people that were considered well off, that were considered beautiful, that were considered healthy. It would promote them having children. So that's a more positive approach, but that's its basic core belief. So its premise is based on Darwin's theory of evolution. They looked at Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and of hereditary evolution and said, well, why can't we apply this to things outside the physical realm? What does that mean? Apply it to poverty, apply it to education. Why can't we make that jump? And it became the basis for racism, particularly racism that was considered more respectable, that was considered somehow okay. Genocide, and of course, as you will see, forced sterilization. The father of eugenics is this guy right here, Francis Galton. Francis Galton actually has a side fame in that he was the inventor, or the person that first discovered fingerprints and categorized fingerprints. But he said eugenics is the study of the agencies under social control that improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So he became kind of this father. But again, he was kind of promoting this idea of making a better human race, of evolving the human race upward. But two philosophies began to emerge. Galton's one that became popular in England was positive eugenics. And again, it sought to promote larger families among the elite. It sought to, have people that were considered beautiful marry each other so that they would have beautiful babies. It was this idea of improving through a more positive means, through encouraging breeding of people that looked beautiful. But then there also became the negative eugenics, which became more popular in the US and then, of course, in Germany. These sought to kind of prevent or limit the population of those deemed degenerates, such as criminals, poor, disabled, and non-white. So again, if you're trying to make the human race better, and your idea of better is blonde, blue-eyed, thin, tall, intelligent, physically fit, wealthy, if that's your idea of better, then the idea of negative, of ones you want to get rid of, are poor, non-white, um, non-Christian, because Christian was also deemed a higher quality, um, disabled, deformed, mentally um, disabled, whether it's through mental illness or intellectually disabled. So, criminal, criminality, alcoholism, addiction, poverty, promiscuity, all of those were considered negative issues. And they started to decide that rather than just promoting the positive, they need to also encourage the negative, which meant trying to stop those individuals from breeding. And that led to forced sterilizations here in America and in Germany, and ultimately in Germany to the Holocaust. So the science behind the idea, is there any truth to it? So while Darwin's theory of evolution played a large role in the foundation of eugenics, Gregor Mendel, do you remember him with the peapods? Well, his ideas on heredity led to many of the more negative outcomes, such as sterilization. Many experts believed society's problems, such as criminality, alcoholism, and prostitution, were hereditary. They also included in that hereditary um, intelligence, and I'm not just talking about people that might be intellectually disabled, but intelligence as in not so bright, C student, D student, or they also looked at poverty. People that seemed to be born poor, seemed born into poverty, and seemed to stay there for so long, generation after generation. Therefore, it must be heredity. So let's look first at Darwin's theories, which are different than eugenics, but it certainly inspired eugenics. So Darwin's theories included the idea that species evolved through natural selection. An animal that was born with a mutation that allowed him to eat a certain seed. Darwin started his theory by looking at finches, and these finches had adapted depending on where they were at in Galapagos, the island. What kind of plant life was there? Their beaks mutated so that they could get the most nutrition from the area where they lived. But he discovered this process was slow, with helpful mutations winning the battle to survive. And he wrote this in his original book, Origin of Species. And the book contains this concept of natural selection and the survival of the fittest. The idea that the mutation that was best won the battle to live and procreate. And again, he started this on his finches in the Galapagos archipelago. So abnormalities, of course, occur in life. There's lots of mutations. Some of these differences do not result in better survival. Some do. If an abnormality which increases survival chances are hereditary, they may be passed on to the next generation, which may then have a stronger survival rate. So the different beaks helped these different finches survive best in their area. Following Darwin's primary usage of the term, it's often used to refer to both the evolutionary consequences of blind selection to its mechanisms. It is sometimes helpful to explicitly distinguish between the selection's mechanism and its effects. When this distinction is important, scientists define natural selection specifically as those mechanisms that contribute to the selection of individuals that reproduce, without regard to whether the basis of the selection is heritable. This is sometimes referred to as phenotypic natural selection. So it's this idea that whichever mutation seems to help can be then inherited. So the survival of the fittest is this idea that the most fit or the best sexual selections will be chosen and pass the finest traits to their offspring. And Herbert Spencer wrote in his reaction to Darwin's theory, this survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is that which Mr. Darwin called natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Fitness is not the strongest, but the most sexually productive. So when we say fit, we don't mean fit like super muscles or really extreme health. The idea is the fittest is the one that wins the ultimate competition, the competition to breed. So this is kind of not consistent with evolution, since every being that reproduces is fit. So germplasm. This was this kind of weird theory that was started, and August Weismann first created this concept of hereditary traits when he theorized material he called germplasm, which influenced the body. So this is the world before DNA. This is the world before we understood what DNA really was. So there was this concept, though, that we inherit certain qualities, certain traits. So he called them germplasm. And his germplasm theory states that multicellular organisms, that's us, consist of germ cells containing heritable information and the stomatic cells that carry out the ordinary body functions. The germ cells are influenced neither by environmental influences nor by learning or morphological changes that happen during the lifetime of an organism, which information is lost after each generation. So what he's saying there is that germ cells are the information that we carry from generation to generation that helped us survive enough to reproduce. Stomatic cells are kind of cells that make us who we are. They're our base cells. These germplasms are kind of our improvement. And then the third piece of the puzzle are things that happen to appear, but they're not really that valuable. So we don't retain their quality to the next generation. All right, so this is where Mendel's experiment comes. This idea was illuminated and explained by the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work in the early years of the 20th century. Scientists rediscovered Mendel, who came up with the concept of dominant and recessive traits. And these are those pea pods that you may have looked at when you were in high school. Mendel's traits were then kind of taken into consideration along with Darwin's theories by this man named Thomas Malthus. And Malthus believed that the natural rate of human reproduction, when unchecked, would lead to geometric increases in population. Population would grow at a ratio of 2 and then 4 and then 8. And you can see this getting higher and higher and higher. However, he believed that food production increased only in arithmetic progression. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, so on. So you can see these are times. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 8 is 16, and so on. Where this one is plus. 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 2 is 6, 6 plus 2 is 8, and so on. So it seemed obvious to him that something had to keep the population in check to prevent wholesale starvation. So what he was saying is that if we don't watch it, we will breed higher or greater than we can feed ourselves. So we have to find a way to stop the population from becoming so large that it's unsustainable. And he said there were only two kinds of ways to do that. Now, I'm sure many of you are already thinking of what the problematic elements are to this. But here's what he said. There are two general kinds of checks that limit population growth: preventive checks and positive checks. Preventive checks reduce the birth rate, and positive checks increase the death rate. Now, we know that this isn't really the whole story, because he's not taking into account this increase. We as a society have increased food production to the point that it is sustainable. He never really thought about increasing that element. But he does have some points to it. We may run out of room. You see that already in Japan and India and China. But there may be other solutions. So basically, he claimed that it is an evident truth that whatever may be the rate of increase in means of sustenance, the increase in population must be limited to it, at least after the food has been divided into the smallest shares that will support life. All the children born beyond what would be required to keep the population to this level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. To act consistently, therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. If we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage other forms of destruction, which we will compel nature to use. So what he's saying is, at a certain point, the population will become too great to sustain if we keep letting people, stopping people from dying. If we keep fixing them, if we keep increasing the age of mortality, eventually we're going to run out of room. So he said, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all the marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we must appropriate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and those benevolent but mistaken men who have thought they were going to do a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total expiration of particular disorders. If by these and similar means the annual mortality were increased, we might probably, every one of us, marry at the age of puberty, and yet fewer be absolutely starved. So what he's saying is we need to encourage people to die. Stop curing them. We need the plague once in a while. We need the massive flood. We need the earthquakes. We got to get rid of these people. So it's a pretty hard idea. But it became something that the eugenicists were obsessed with. So Galton we have. He's the one that actually coined the term eugenics. But he was more interested in the positive eugenics. The American Eugenics Society, which was supported by the richest, that should be richest, sorry, it's my T, Americans like Carnegie and Rockefeller. It was run by Davenport in Cold Springs, New York, and this one promoted a more negative eugenics. So these eugenicists formed councils and committees to decide who was unfit. And the ones they focused on were the poor, the criminal, the feeble-minded. We're going to talk more about that one in a second. The so-called primitive. The Jews, because Christians were considered more fit. And again, that should remind you of something. The immigrant, but most of all, the other. So social Darwinism, which is basically eugenics, was Darwin's theory applied to social issues. So it's basically the survival, the survival of the economically fittest. England had invested a lot of taxes in maintaining poorhouses. Once the Church of England was born, and the Catholic Church was no longer housing the poor. Instead, the Church of England was, which was supported by the government of England. Suddenly, it was the taxes maintaining the poorhouses. Excuse me, I have to get something to drink. So these taxes sparked resentment among the wealthier classes. Which laid fertile ground for Malthus' ideas of, these parasites to spread, linking population of the lower classes to economic disasters. So again, the poor, the disabled, the insane, the criminal were all deemed drains on societies. And when experts like Spencer and Galton gave a hereditary link to their undesirability, limiting their numbers became a goal. And does this sound kind of familiar? It should. The poor in England was divided into three groups, basically. Sorry about that. The helpless, old, disabled children. These guys were worthy of charity. They could not help their state. They were basically kind of the ones everybody feels sorry for. So, they couldn't help where they were at. The second piece was the able-bodied poor. They were the jobless, those that worked in workhouses. This is in England. And paid out of the poor rate. This was the tax. So these guys seemed less worthy. These guys were the bloodsuckers. Why should we be paying for that, right? They should just go get a job. Again, sound familiar? And the third groups were considered the rogues and vagabonds. Often petty criminals, and in fact, they were encouraged to be beaten on sight. These were the ones that were stuck in the pillories and had rotten fruit thrown at them and so on. This is a picture of an English workhouse. So the act that was passed in 1601, the main point of this act, this was the act about taking care of the poor. The important poor were to be cared for in almshouses. Impotent poor, were to be cared in almshouses or poorhouse. So the law offered relief to people who were unable to work, mainly those that were, quote, lame, impotent, old, and blind. The able-bodied poor were to be set to work in a house of industry. Materials were provided for the poor to be set to work. The idle poor and vagrants were to be sent to a house of correction or even prison. And finally, pauper children were to become apprentices. All right, this led to the sterilization eventually, as soon as that procedure became available. So, due to Davenport and other eugenicists, sterilizing undesirables slowly became public policy. So, the sterilization started first within the prison system, mainly as a means of controlling masturbation. The idea was that masturbation was wrong because men were wasting their seed. And then there became theories out there because masturbation was often seen in prisons due to the fact that these men were confined. It began to be seen as something that was linked to criminality. It was also linked to health issues. There was a belief that it would degenerate your health, that those who were mentally incompetent, who were intellectually disabled, masturbated more. So there was this kind of weird linking based on anecdotal observation. So many eugenicists began suggesting that that it would stop the number of undesirables if you sterilized those that were masturbating. And it soon spread from prison systems to homes for the feeble-minded or institutional care. Feeble-mindedness was this odd category that existed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it kind of was not those that were intellectually disabled, like someone with Down syndrome, but rather those that just were not very bright, that seemed like they were difficult to educate. Many might have been learning disabled. Maybe they were autistic. Those categories didn't exist at this time. So many of them were stuck together in this catch-all phrase. So in this desire to improve the human race, doctors and social scientists began designating undesirables. By the way, these were often non-white as well as feeble-minded. Now I say often, not always. There were plenty of feeble-minded that were white as well, but many more proportionally were non-white. So this action sparked the creation of standardized testings like the IQ test and the SAT, and led to the formation of marriage laws. Suddenly, they didn't want to mix race. Well, I mean, they never really wanted to mix races, but it soon became laws stopping the mixing of races, stopping you from marrying someone who was defective. And this quest to rid the world of future undesirables led to new intellectual designations like moron and imbecile for those with cognitive disabilities. So this is a picture from the Cold Spring Harbor Eugenics archives, and this is pictures of criminal brains. I love this because look at these categories. So this one here is criminal, and this brain, obviously see it's criminal, right? Is an alcoholic vagrant, meaning it's a homeless alcoholic person. The brain is narrow and simple. How will they know that those things are connected? Yeah, maybe. And it has the weight, but then it also says the mother died insane. And this is my favorite part. This is a Canadian brain. You can tell, right? Uh-huh. So here's another criminal brain. This one is a sexual pervert and also a vagrant, meaning homeless. You can see the brain is broad with short annulus. Then it has our weight. And this brain, the person had a goiter, which means it had a big lump on his neck. And the parents were unknown. This guy was American. You can see the difference, right? All right, now down here we have another criminal brain. This criminal committed rape. The brain is long and uneven. And we also have our weight. This is, I believe it's stone, 1230. I'm not sure about that. The parents are unknown, and this one's American. Another criminal, alcoholic vagrant. The brain is long and simple, and the parents are unknown. And this is another Canadian brain. You can tell the difference between the American and the Canadian, right? This one is a vagrant, meaning a homeless person. The brain is long, square-ended, and simple. Not quite sure how you tell when a brain is simple, but the parents and siblings were normal. This brain was Irish. And our final criminal brain that's pictured is a paretic vagrant, meaning probably someone who had cerebral palsy and was homeless. The brain is long, narrow, and unequal. It's atrophobic, meaning the brain has atrophied. That might have something to do with the paretic, meaning the paralysis. It may have been damaged. Parents are unknown, and this brain is Italian. Now these two up here, notice how they designate these two. They're normal. We don't know what their country of origin is. We don't know anything else about them. They're just designated normal. So that's interesting how we have normal brains with no connections, and yet all of our criminal brains have these bizarre connections. This is another piece from a newspaper that was published in the early 1900s. And this particular one was an article about the campaign for juvenile mental defectives. And what I thought was interesting about this is it lists, and now these are not insulting terms. These are terms used by neurologists and psychologists. And this is how they designated children. Moron, which is mentally a 10 to 12 years old. And this particular person would be able to do work requiring reason and judgment. Now our next step down, and again, remember these are not insults. These are medical terms, is a high-grade imbecile. This person, according to this study, is mentally 8 to 10 years old and can do complex manual work. Our next step down is a medium imbecile, mentally 6 to 8 years old, able to do simple manual work. Next one is a low-grade imbecile, mentally 4 to 5 years old, able to do simple menial work, meaning like maybe sweeping a floor. The last one is idiot, mentally 3 to 4 years or under, and the only thing this child is capable of, or even up to adulthood, would be self-preservation. So, interesting ways they designated at that time. So, what the eugenics were trying to do was stop social degeneration. So, what is that? Degeneracy comes from 4 main sources. There is physiological, which is self-pollution and declining health or fitness. This was a prevailing idea that focused on masturbation, which was the loss of which they believe was a loss of semen, and they felt that led to criminality, feeble-mindedness, and ultimately insanity. I know those of you who masturbate are probably thinking, oh my God. But that was the philosophy at the time. Not saying it was correct. Alcoholism, and finally, there was occupational exposure. They did kind of submit that some occupations could result in declining health or fitness. In particular, ones that they focused on might be mining, particularly coal mining, and of course, particularly among these children, would be chimney sweeps. At the time, that was an actual job where small children would be kept small by starving them and feeding them inappropriately, and then they would put them down chimneys to clean. So you imagine the soot and smoke they would inhale. The other degeneracies included moral. Individuals that had this might be innate criminalities. They were just, born bad. They've done criminal activities all their life. Repeat offenders, often usually petty crimes. And promiscuousness, meaning sexually active. This is particularly important for women. Women that were seen as wanting to have sex were considered morally degenerate. You aren't supposed to enjoy sex. It was okay for men, bad for women. Also in this moral category would be gender identity issues. Transgendered is not a new phenomenon. It existed at that time as well. And individuals that would start dressing as different genders or would start to, act in a way inappropriate for their gender identity would be considered morally degenerate. Homosexuality was also morally degenerate, and sometimes the result of that would be things from forced rape for women that were lesbians to everything from electric shock treatment to cold water immersion treatment for those that might be male homosexuals. The next one would be mental. This would be feeble-mindedness. Again, feeble-mindedness, this all-encompassing, undefined term, and insanity. People that were mentally ill. And finally, there's economic, which is basically poverty. And poverty at that time was very severe. More of the unfit was the primitives, which this was part of this theory at the time called the white man's burden. And this was the idea that individuals that lived in less developed communities were somehow the burden to be taken care of by white individuals. This justified colonization, slavery, all kinds of things. And this resulted from this kind of linear view of evolution, this idea that we were descendants from apes, that this kind of line was drawn. And therefore they looked at these more primitive societies, such as those in Africa or Native American tribes, and said, look, those individuals are less. They're degenerate. They're unfit. We need to take care of them. This justified the taking of Native American children from their homes and putting them in foster care, being raised by white individuals, and so on. I'm going to stop for just a second and continue on.